Okay, my name is Joe Nakamura. I was born in May of 1941, and that was in Los Angeles, California. I presently live in the city of Orange, but I spent my childhood here in the city of Cypress. I think it's an extension of Anaheim. I grew up in Cypress, California, started grade school. Then my parents moved to a location at what is now Valley View and Cerritos. And I don't know whether that was Anaheim or Cypress at the time. But from there, my parents moved to the city of Anaheim in, I think, about 1953. They bought a farm, and the location of the farm is West Anaheim, the corner of Dale and Orange. I went to this Anaheim High School. After high school, I attended the University of California, Berkeley, and I met my wife there. And shortly after graduation, we got married. I then moved to Hawaii, and I started my architectural profession in Hawaii. I worked for a large firm. We primarily in projects, tourist-oriented projects, hotels. Our projects that we worked on were in the South Pacific, the Orient. It's a very exciting time, being young and with very little responsibility. But as time holds its way, as your parents get older, you feel a need to come back and visit to take care or look in on your parent. So my wife and I packed up after a stay in Hawaii. We moved back to Southern California. We moved to Westminster, a short stay there, and then we moved to Anaheim. And as I worked in Southern California, it was then that in 1983, I had a business partner, and we opened up our own architectural firm, called Nakamura and Architects, Inc. And for 20 years, we had the business. We finally called it quits after 20 years, and I've now been retired for approximately 20 years. So that's the ballpark, but there's all the other stories involved that you may want to discuss with me.
How many siblings do you have?
I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. 2 of us, like I said previously, was that my sister and I were born in Los Angeles prior to the war. My sister, older, was born, I believe she was born in 1939, and I was born in 1941, just prior to World War II breaking out. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, December 1941. I was approximately 7 years old. I mean, 7 months old, I'm sorry.
Do your siblings live in Anaheim?
Do they live in Anaheim?
Yes.
I have an older sister that lives in Anaheim. I have a brother that lives in Anaheim. I have another brother that lives in Santa Ana. And I have a sister, the youngest sister. She lives in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Could you please tell me a little bit about your parents and their background?
Okay. My parents is a little unique in considering other Japanese families. Both my mother and father were born here in the United States. My father was born in Upland, California in 1913, and his name is Wilson Seiichi Nakamura. Wilson, people ask, how does one come about being named Wilson? Well, he was born during the Woodrow Wilson administration. He was thereby named in honor of Woodrow Wilson. My mother, on the other hand, was born in San Francisco, May of 1920. And they both were able to spend their childhood in terms of probably till about 3 or 4 years of age, 6 years of age. And they were somehow needed by the family living in Japan to return back to Japan. Now, my parents, being born here, are American citizens, but they went back to study in Japan, and as they became adults, my dad was sent back to the United States when he was 17 to look for better work. It was during the Depression, 1930, and with $20 American in his pocket, Grandpa sent him over and said, go make a life for yourself. So he came to Venice, California, and became an itinerant farm worker. My mother, on the other hand, stayed in Japan, and of course my dad didn't know her at that time, but as my dad spent his adolescent and young age, adult age here, trying to make a life, between 1930 and 1938, my dad traveled the Central Valley and the desert communities as an itinerant worker, as I said previously. In 1938, he received a telegram telling him that his mother had passed away. He had not seen his mother since he left Japan when he was 17 years old. So he got the first accommodations that he could, and this is all ship travel at that time. So he had to wait, and finally he was able to find his way back to his mother's grave. But he also had work here in the United States. So in trying to balance being at his mother's grave and having to come back to the United States, he decided to get married. He wound up with a selection of picture brides, as they used to call them. And he had a selection of 18 eligible ladies. And in a couple of weeks' time, or I don't know what the time duration was, but very short, he selected my mom. And she and my dad, my mother was 18 at the time, they got married and they came back to the United States. They wound up having their own business in farming in Redondo Beach. And then, of course, the war broke out. So.
Were your parents, your family was incarcerated?
No, they were not. Some of the stories that people are, Japanese American people, are not aware of in my generation, they were not aware that Japanese Americans, at the time of the signing of Executive Order 9066, that you had an option. People did not understand that there was an option. My dad chose the option, and the option was you could voluntarily evacuate. Of course, it was a forced evacuation. But instead of being confined in what was an unknown situation, because the term camp or internment camp hadn't been established at that time. Everybody was surrounded or picked up, and they were put into a place called assembly centers. And these assembly centers were like the Santa Anita Race Park here in Southern California. My dad chose to leave the West Coast before the deadline of March 31st, 1942. The executive order was signed February of 1942. There was a time frame of about 6 weeks in order for families to decide whether to leave the West Coast in a forced voluntary evacuation or be rounded up and put into incarcerated camps. So my dad chose to leave.
What were the family living condition like in the
Okay.
voluntary relocation?
My dad chose with 3 other families to relocate to the state of Utah. Prior to arriving in Utah, the Western Defense Command here in California required all voluntary evacuees to sign up a change of residence form. And in it, the War Department, it was a requirement of the War Department at the time. So as my parents wound up in Utah, it was in Layton, Utah, they had to sign up. Now, the living conditions, as we understand from the conversation and stories from people who went to camp, the living condition in Utah was not the best. My parents and the four families, or the three other families, wound up living in what they called a converted chicken coop. There was a dilapidated building, wood, dirt floors, and all four families slept in that one building, side by side, head, toe, head, toe, head, toe, for a number of months, because that was the only building available for the four families to live in. And I wrote a history book for my family, and I have photographs of that building and the conditions. It was cold. The winters are very cold. But that spring, my dad decided that he didn't want my family living under those conditions. So he went out and somehow managed to find lumber during the time of war. And he was able to build a small home for my mother and his growing family. So I have photographs showing the home that he built in relationship to the living conditions that he had to face when he first wound up in Utah in the March of 1942. Living conditions, if you're just speaking of living conditions, that's one subject matter. If you're talking about how did the community treat people, that would be another story. So I don't know which direction you would like to go.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how the community treat people?
For community treatment?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I can only give you short vignettes of it. You have to understand, I'm only a 4, 5, 6-year-old. There's not a whole lot that I can tell you, because at that age, I don't even remember the snow that fell in the wintertime. But I do recall 2 instances, and that was as I was getting to be 5 years old, 6 years old. And if it's permissible, my parents spoke Japanese at home. We did not speak English. So for me, as a child, going to kindergarten for the first time, I had no knowledge of or command of the English language. Dad dropped me off. I had to go to the bathroom. I went to the teacher, hand signs and everything. Teacher couldn't understand Japanese. I couldn't understand English. And so I wet my pants and I cried. So those are the little picture vignettes that I have, a traumatic experience. And the second experience that I remember was the landlord on the farm that my dad was renting from. One year he had slaughtered a cattle. Food was hard to get during the war. There was a rationing system. You got ration tickets and ration coupons, and you could only purchase those items with the coupons. So when the neighbor or the landlord had slaughtered this cattle, we were all in amazement. I know I was there. I was watching it. and my parents were, my dad was watching it. And after the man had quartered the cattle, he turned around and he gave my dad some of the beef. And this was a white man. The story of the Japanese American camp people saying, what about the discrimination and the problems you were facing out there in the real outside? Well, my parents were in the real outside. But the landlord, these people in the surrounding neighborhood, the community, they were all white people. Now I can only speak for myself. As a 5 or 6 year old, I probably didn't understand the term discrimination, but the children that I went to school with, we never had a problem. And that's speaking from a kindergartner and a first grader. Now in first grade, I was introduced to Christmas. I didn't speak the language, I didn't have command of the language, but now as a first grader, the school was celebrating Christmas. We had to have, well, in those days we had an exchange gift, just like we do here. Well, so my dad and I went to the store and picked up a small item, and wrapped it up and took it to school. And not understanding the process of exchange gifts, the little guy before me went and grabbed my gift from under the tree and he took it. And again, not understanding, I started crying and telling the teacher that that's my gift, you know. And the teacher assured me, no, we do an exchange. And that concept just wasn't there for me. Being in a totally Japanese-speaking family and environment, all the neighbors that my family chose to be with were all Japanese. They all spoke Japanese. Now, for me, English is a second language. But the teacher turned around and said, no, Joe, come over here and you pick anything you want. And I remember the toy. It was a little alligator on some wheel. You pull the string and let it go and the alligator would scoot around on the floor. But that's about the only pictures or memory I have of living during the war. The rest of it, my parents would speak. But during my lifetime, my parents never spoke harshly about the war conditions in Utah. Living on the outside, we didn't face the discrimination or bias that so many people who went to camp discuss and say, well, you must have had this, you must have had that. There were instances that my parents used to talk about, and that would be in the middle of the night, some of the local teenagers would tip the outhouse over. And that's the only source of sanitation. Well, you know, the next morning you get up and all the adults at the time would have to tip it back over. But that was probably the extent of mischief that occurred during our period there.
Did your parents feel that it's unfair because the government never did this to the German American or anybody else during World War I?
I have to be honest. My parents never spoke about the war. And like many Japanese American families of my generation, their parents never probably had a heart-to-heart conversation with their children. The war happened. It happened very quickly. The incarceration happened very quickly. I don't believe there was a time for people to sit back and judge it. Now, 50 years later, perhaps there are very vocal people that are either strongly opposed to it or let it go. So I can't speak for them. I can't speak for my parents. They never brought it up. So.
Looking back at the past, how did you feel about it? What lesson did you learn from during that time period?
A lesson?
Yes, like what happened?
There are some, when it comes to possibly the subject matter of discrimination, I have to be honest. I was too young to understand that terminology. I was too young to feel that physical situation. My parents, being farmers, always living in a farming community. When my parents returned to Anaheim and started farming in Southern California, again, there was a community of Japanese Americans, families and farms that were adjacent to each other. So these are little farms, but primarily, I think the parents' generation found comfort in being next to families of same like-kind people. So as farmers, living in Cyprus in those days, Cyprus and Anaheim, the other people in the community, the white people in the community, they were also hard-working people. They had dairies. We were next to a dairy. My family farmed next to a dairy. Dairy people, they're hardworking. Then there were the other people, but living in Cyprus at that time and Anaheim on the west end, it was primarily orange orchards and orange groves. It was before Disneyland. It was all two-lane highways or streets with no center line. It was just you moved over to the side if you had to. I don't know what my parents would say. I know that growing up, as I retired and I had more time with my parents, I tried to get conversation in that direction, and my dad and mom would say, it happened. It happened. And look at us now. Look at where we do. Look at what we have accomplished. The war was a time frame in history. And I don't know why my parents didn't speak about it. If I can, I'd like to make one little instance here. When we returned after the war, there is a group of Japanese families that would have picnics in Los Angeles. They were called Kenjinkai or Ken picnics, meaning that people who lived in the same prefecture in Japan, who are now immigrants here, they would get together and hold annual picnic. It was at the annual picnic that I fully began to understand what World War II was about. Since it wasn't spoken all through grade school and even junior high school, I didn't know the full context of it. When my parents met up with friends who spent their time incarcerated in the relocation camps, I remember Dad's friends coming to him and saying, "Hey, Wilson, you were stupid, you know. Why did you go off on your own? You know, if you would have went to camp, they fed you. Everything was given to you. Medical supplies. If you wanted to work, you got a work furlough and you could go out and work. So why did you choose to go on your own? You know, you should have stayed with us and gone to camp with us." So there I can begin to feel some of the animosities of the people that went to camp. Now, like I said previously, the term and terminology camp wasn't even established at that time. It was after they had gone to camp. And I would assume that they took, shortened the word from internment camps or relocation camps, and they started calling it camp. But the people from the camp couldn't understand why, if the government did just so much for them, even though they were incarcerated, they had food on the table. They didn't have to worry about it. They had a roof over their heads. Granted, the conditions weren't ideal at all, and they were confined. Whereas my dad and my uncle, they went outside. They chose to go out and live a normal life that they could. Volunteer evacuees had that choice. They were able to live without barbed wire fences, but they had to earn their living. They had to make money to bring food to the table. They had to find some means of shelters. There were no Motel 6s in those days. It was a situation where you had to be dedicated, and you had to see if you can see the big picture. Granted, these little vignettes that I have, I can't explain how my parents did it, but they were able to do all these things. In Utah, during the war, religion couldn't be practiced. They couldn't practice Buddhism. There was a condition that my dad used to say that adult males in any number more than 3 or 4 was completely prohibited. So you had government people keeping an eye on the Japanese American. You also have to remember, today's people focus only on the people who went to camp. There were people like my parents who chose not to go to camp. But the other group of people that they're totally forgetting are the natural Japanese Americans that were living within the borders of the East and the West Coast that are not identified. There had to be hundreds of thousands of other Japanese Americans that were untouched by the incarceration or the forced evacuation. Now, I tried to research that, and I was able to get to the point where there were approximately 8,000, and later that number jumped up to 12 to 15,000 volunteer evacuees that chose to evacuate on their own. I tried to find a number of the Japanese American population across the United States during those years. I could not find any information, but there had to be other Japanese Americans living out throughout the United States. And it's never been brought to the forefront, and it's always been a concern and a curiosity on my part. When they tell the story of World War II and the incarceration, I'd like to know the rest of it, if it existed.
Do you know why your parents decided to go back to California after?
Well, they're farmers, basically. Utah has a short farming season. It's very cold. Like I said, living conditions. It's not like today where you have the comfort of forced air heating and air conditioning, whatever. You're living in a shack. So, warmer weather, plenty of farm country in California, and I'm sure that was one of the reasons. And the people that were incarcerated also returned to the West Coast. So you had previous friends, probably family friends, that had also come back to the Southern California or the California coast. And so again, strength in number, strength in familiarity, having friends that were sharing similar problems.
Like you say, when your parents come back to California, they didn't come to Anaheim first, but they come to a different place. Why did your parents?
There's no rhyme or reason. I'm sure it was the availability of farming parcels, and also probably due to the fact that some of their friends had come earlier and they had settled into like Cyprus or East Anaheim or West Anaheim. I'm sure that had a factor. Again, friends, being able to be with people of your like kind. Again, Anaheim was probably one of this, in my opinion, in my experience, was probably one of the safest cities for minorities. And I'm not just talking about Japanese Americans, I'm talking about a group of people. Anaheim at that time was heavily German Americans. And that's why Anaheim, Anna's home, when it's translated back. At least that's what I was told. A lot of my friends were of German ethnicity. So there's so much emphasis on discrimination and bias and so forth, and they all ask the same question always about us during World War II. I would be not truthful if I weren't able to tell you, I don't know. I can't remember. Growing up as a teenager, growing up as a high school student, I never encountered any of those kinds of problems in any great number. Oh, there were a few here and there. If I can go back to once when I started grade school in Anaheim. It was called Magnolia Elementary School. It is now called Maddie Lou Maxwell. She was the principal at the time, Maddie Lou Maxwell. My very first day on the school ground, that was about the 7th grade, somebody referred to me and called me a dirty Jap. Needless to say, there was an argument and a fight. I was called into the principal's office. And Mrs. Maxwell, Mr. Nakamura, this was your first day at the school. Why do you do this? Why are you fighting? And I explained to her what had occurred. And she was remiss. She said, I didn't know that. Well, let me verify that. So she went to the older kids class kids, and the older class kids confirmed that this person had called me a derogatory term. And so she, in turn, pulled the guy in, reprimanded him, and asked him to apologize to me. So when you have a principal who will check and verify for you and make you feel like you did nothing wrong, well, that's the kind of feeling that I had living here in Anaheim. I had friends that would tell me, and if I can talk to you about my life a little bit, my friends were mostly white kids. Their parents accepted me. We never had that encounter. When I started high school, at Anaheim High School, one of the teachers who taught U.S. history, and if I may, I'll use his name, Mr. Vineyard, the day that he was going to speak about the war situation as a historical event, he took me aside and he said, Joe, I'm a history teacher and I have to teach you kids about the history of the United States. And in it, I have to tell you the story of World War II and how Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. I don't want you to feel ashamed, embarrassed, or if I'm picking on you, but it's part of the history that I need to translate and pass on to the students, your co-students. And he turned around and asked me if I felt comfortable. And to have a teacher go out of his way, pull me aside, and make me feel comfortable in discussing World War II in his classroom, that was phenomenal. That in itself, to me, spoke volumes of the people that lived here and taught here in Anaheim. The second one was Miss Golder. She was my English teacher. Now, as I mentioned earlier, English was my second language. She picked up on that. And she said, yes, you need to improve on your vocabulary and your conversation. And of course, in those days, there weren't specialists or anything, but she said, Joe, every time you hear a word you don't understand, ask what it means. Constantly ask what you don't understand. Ask what it means. And use the word over and over again. And always have conversation. That's all you can do to encourage yourself. So, and here's the case where you remember little vignettes of your life. We had to get up and memorize a poem and give the poem, speak the poem in the classroom. Knowing my problem, she was so nice. She picked the shortest poem in the book, and I believe that the poem was Trees, and I think their author was Joyce Kilmer. It just stays with me. But it was 4 lines maybe, and that's all I had to do, while the other kids had these long poems that they had to recite. So when I reflect on those things, I get this warm feeling. I really did not understand discrimination. And I may be the only one, but I'm almost certain that the Japanese American kids that grew up here in Anaheim during my time probably were not aware of discrimination either, unless it came in your face type thing, and that didn't occur. My dad and mom lived all that time in Anaheim, and I don't ever remember them talking about being discriminated. The only discrimination came as I grew older. After leaving Anaheim and going into the real world, Anaheim was a very conservative farming community. Everybody worked hard. It didn't matter what ethnicity you were. I went to UCLA. Bam! I had never seen so many Japanese Americans gathered in one place. And these were just students. But there are some stories, I don't know that I would be comfortable saying, that was biased and it was discriminatory. But having the background of so many people here in Anaheim, in Orange County, I kind of let it wash off my back. Then I got to Berkeley. For a naive, conservative child being thrown into this, I don't know what you'd call it, very liberal academic society. And I mean, it's very liberal. Your head starts spinning. You go, wow, wow. There was so much happening in San Francisco, Berkeley. We had the free speech movement. I got involved in that. I almost got arrested. But my dad's voice kept saying, you get arrested up there, you're in big trouble. So I bailed out. But it was after graduating from Berkeley and having the difference of living in conservative Orange County, moving to very liberal Northern California, Berkeley, coming back to Orange County after graduating was the first time that I felt real discrimination. It was my very first professional interview for a job. And I won't tell you where it happened, but it did happen here in Orange County. I was pretty good. Essentially, I was a very good student. I was a very good student of architecture. In fact, I was probably up on the top end of the class. I came back here with my portfolio, and I went to a large architectural firm. I walked in, I said I'm looking for a job. I pulled out my resume, and the person right behind the desk, she turned around and said, "Oh, we're sorry, we're not taking any job applications at the time. We don't have any openings. So you can leave your application or your resume, but we absolutely have nothing available." And so I said, "Thank you," and I walked out. And as I got to the parking lot, my classmate from Berkeley, same class, not quite as talented as I am, and I'm not bragging, he said, "Hey, Joe, wait a minute. I'm going to drop off my resume here." And so I said, "They're not hiring. They're not hiring. She just told me that there's absolutely nothing available." And so I said, "Okay, I'll wait for you and we'll go to lunch." Well, he went in. 10 minutes goes by. Half an hour goes by. An hour goes by. He's not out yet. And a couple minutes later, he comes out and he says, "What do you mean there's no job? I got a job." Well, he was white. I wasn't. And on that very day, I said, "So this is what happens."
How did you feel at that time?
How did I feel? There aren't words to describe it. You just don't know what went wrong. Not having faced discrimination of this caliber before, it was hard to internalize what you felt. You knew it was discrimination. But it was only one instance in my entire life up to graduating college. This is my first real instance of discrimination. I don't have words for it. To this day, every time I think of it, I say, I know what the word means now. But I can't I can't verbalize the feeling. After that instance, I went to other firms within Orange County, and they all said no. I went into Los Angeles, and I went through a number of firms there, and they all said, "Leave your resume," and never got called back. So I left my name with the AIA office, the American Institute of Architects office in the city of LA, and lo and behold, I got a call. Said, "Somebody needs help. And if you're interested, we'll give you his name and you can go and check it out." Well, it was a Japanese architect. It's a one-man office, Japanese by ethnicity, and he was working out of his house. And I thought, is this what I'm going to be faced with in this profession? Well, just about that time, my college roommate, who was from Hawaii, I chatted with him and he said, "Joe, come over to Hawaii. Plenty of jobs." I said, "You're kidding?" He said, No, plenty of jobs." So Carol and I had just recently gotten married. Before we could settle down here, we packed up our stuff, and it may have been 1 or 2 suitcases. We didn't have much responsibility in those days. So we shipped what we had to have, and there wasn't a whole lot. We flew over to Hawaii. First week there, went looking for a job, and he was right. There was job opening.
Thank you so much for spending time with us today, telling many great stories, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you for asking me.
Thank you so much.
Enjoyed the conversation, the interview. I hope your project is successful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.